All right, how you guys doing today? So what do we have next week? We have exam 3. So exam 3 will cover from the musculoskeletal system all the way through today's lecture. So the material from today's lecture will be on that exam. The exam will not include muscular histology though. You actually had that on your second exam. So it'll be the muscular system. I will let you guys know that the exam is about 75% neurology and only 25% muscular. So that should give you, at least at this point, that should give you a gross idea of where you want to focus your studies. It's going to be a lot heavier into neurology because we've done a lot more neurology, a lot more nuanced. I will probably look at doing a review maybe during lab time. Maybe at the beginning of lab I'll do a review for the final exam. I've done something just a little different just to see how it goes. It is 50 questions, 50 question multiple choice exam, and there will be no essay questions.
For the final?
No, for this one.
For this one.
Right,
Okay.
for exam 3. All the exams you've had up to this point have had essay questions. This one won't, and we will see how people do with that. And see if the essay questions, I believe, look, they have harmed some people, so we will see how this one goes, and that may help some of you who are weaker in your essays. Sound like a plan? So it'll be 50 questions, 2 points a question, 100-point test, 50 question Scantron. I would say that I would be able to grade it for you guys after you take it, but I won't be able to because the Scantron reader will be closed by the time you guys are done. They close down at 5, so I won't be able to grade them until lab next week. So we'll do the same thing we've always done. First 20-30 minutes of lab, we'll go over the exam, and you guys can ask questions and challenge, and you know, we'll do the same thing that we've always done. So you guys okay with that? Any questions over anything that we have covered thus far?
So we're doing a review on Thursday?
Yeah, I'll look at doing it. So when you guys come in for lab, we'll look at doing a review then. Since I think the lab is just one. Is it just one?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it'll be, we'll actually have spare time during that lab to do a review. And I don't want to do a review because a good part of the material that's on the test is getting covered today, so it wouldn't really make sense to talk about a review now before I've had a chance to cover some of the main concepts that you guys will get today and have some visual aids. And as always, I have some drawings on the board. Okay, so any other questions before we get going? Are you guys doing all right? All right. It's kind of warm in here. It was cold outside though. It's pretty chilly outside. Warm in here. All right. You guys have a good weekend? Hopefully. All right. I was up in Ruidoso riding my bike all weekend.
It's snowing up there right now.
Yeah. We got rained on pretty hard, so it was just a muddy, awful mess for about half of the race, and then the other half it dried out. Yeah, it turned out okay. The age categories of the race are kind of weird because I'm competing with 20-year-olds that are, you know, nothing hurts on the 20-year-olds. So. Yeah, that's the way it goes. Can't wait. As soon as I cross that 49, as soon as I cross 49, I'll be in a category all my own. I won't have to compete with 20-year-olds anymore. All right, so we've talked, pretty much what we've done up to this point is we've talked about the histology of the nervous system. We've talked about the neurons, the neuroglial cells. We've talked about some of the pathways that are involved. And we've talked about information and some of the structures, but not what they do in any sort of detail. So what we're going to do today is we're now going to start talking about how the nervous system as a system works. So we're going to move away from neurons and glial cells, and we're going to go to the system. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how do we get information in and out of the central nervous system, right? That's a good place to start, okay? We understand that there's some sort of integration or processing of information that occurs, and we've already talked about some of those processes, such as spinal reflexes, right? The reflex arch, the reflex arc that I demonstrated for you guys on the board, and you actually did some of those tests on yourselves in the labs. But let's go ahead and talk about how we get information in and out of the brain and spinal cord. So there are really two ways. There are two major ways to get information in and out. Remember, information coming in comes in through afferent pathways and then comes out through efferent pathways, right? Generally, afferent is sensory information coming in, efferent is motor information coming out. That information coming in and out can come in and out in two different ways. It can either come in or out of the central nervous system through what are called spinal nerves. These are nerves that branch off of your spinal cord. And that makes sense because your spinal cord, right, comes out of the foramen magnum, the skull, and then it goes down through the forama of your vertebral, right, your vertebral forama. And as it goes down, okay, as it passes by the different vertebrae, you have what are called nerve roots that branch out. And so if you look at the spinal cord, and I've drawn this for you, and you have drawings of this in your book. If you look at the spinal cord, and I cut a section through it, what kind of section have I cut through this?
Transverse.
This would be a transverse view that we're looking at here, okay? What we'd actually see this on both sides, both the right and left side. I've omitted drawing it on the left side for the sake of simplicity, but you would see this on both sides, okay? All right, so you'd slice through it, you'd see that little central canal that's filled with cerebral spinal fluid. You would also see that the spinal cord, as well as the brain, is lined in connective tissue that protects it. And collectively, that connective tissue is known as what? What do we call the connective tissue that covers our central nervous system?
Meninges.
The meninges, right? You know, the meninges, right? And the meninges are very different from other types of lining, right? Because you're used to parietal and visceral lining, right? We've talked about so far. But when it comes to the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and the brain, the lining consists of 3 layers. And I just remember that the meninges form a pad of protection around the brain. So brain and spinal cord. So the innermost layer, which is a thin, fragile layer, okay, which is very difficult to discern from either the brain or the spinal cord, is known as the pia mater, okay? And then on top of the pia mater is a thicker membrane known as the arachnoid membrane, okay? And then finally on top of the arachnoid membrane is a thick, tough outer layer known as the dura mater, right, or tough mother. Remember, we got to appreciate the meninges in the lab, right? When you guys did the brain dissection, you had to cut through the meninges, peel the meninges off to access the brain. You guys remember doing that, right? You were cutting mainly through the dura and arachnoid because the pia is almost indistinguishable from the brain and spinal cord. So you guys okay with that? It forms a pad of protection. And we know that in between some of these layers, okay, particularly between the dura and the arachnoid membrane, you have cerebral spinal fluid. So you have cerebral spinal fluid out here as well as inside. And remember, we talked about this in the lab, that CSF is a kind of a double protective mechanism, both inside and outside of the central nervous system, as well as the various layers of the meninges. So clearly this is kind of some important stuff here because it's so well protected, right? Because not only do we have the meninges, but you also have bone, right? You have the skull and you have the vertebrae themselves protecting this. So this is these are very well protected structures. And what you have is at the level of the vertebrae, okay, and I've got my little model here, with the crystal skull here, all right, and you can see the spinal cord as it goes through the foramen, okay, we're looking at the cervical vertebrae here, and do you see this coming out here and this coming out here? Do you see that? On each side. These are the spinal nerves that are coming off of the spinal cord. Okay, you have a nerve that comes off at one side of the vertebrae and a nerve that comes off of the other side. Okay, I've just drawn one side here. So far so good? You guys okay with that? Now, interestingly enough, when we look at this transverse section of the spinal cord, you see kind of a little starfish-shaped pattern in the center of the cord that is dark in appearance. And as you might have guessed, that would be gray matter of the spinal cord. The gray matter is in the center. And so you have got cell bodies. Okay? And then surrounding that is the white matter. Okay? So far so good? Okay, nothing new there. All right, excellent. So what we have coming off of the spinal cord are what are called nerve roots. Okay? And the nerve roots come off in the front and the back, and then they join together to make the nerve. So what we're seeing here on the skull, okay, this is a nerve, okay, so what we're looking at here is this right here, okay? We're not actually looking at the nerve roots themselves, okay? And if, just to orient you, imagine coming out of the board, this is popping out of the board, okay, this would be ventral, so what, this ventral also means what? Anterior. So this would be anterior, and then back behind here would be dorsal or posterior, okay? So I have a root, a nerve root that comes out the back, and a nerve root that comes out the front, and then they join together to make the spinal nerve itself. And then that spinal nerve goes off and it innervates other parts of the body. You guys okay with that? Now the reason that we have to appreciate the dorsal root and the ventral root is that different pathways are in different roots. Okay? And so the first pathway that I want to talk about is pretty straightforward. And this is the majority of the afferent information that comes into the spinal cord. Okay, so afferent information is what?
Sensory.
It's sensory information going up to the brain. You guys good with that? Okay, so if I touch this board, I have pressure, right? I feel temperature, I can feel vibration, those kinds of things. That sensory information travels through afferent neurons. They go up through my arm into what that's called a nerve plexus, and then that plexus then goes in, and eventually it goes up into the spinal nerve. Now, at this point, the afferent pathways go up through the dorsal root, okay? So the dorsal root is where all of my sensory information is coming in to the spinal cord, and then it goes up to the brain. You guys cool with that? So sensory information comes in the spinal nerve, and then it exits onto the spinal, or enters, the exit entrance ramp. Okay, look at this as kind of like an exit or an entrance ramp to get onto the highway, the interstate, if you will, is the dorsal root. You guys cool with that? But remember, what kinds of neurons am I talking about primarily when I talk about sensory neurons? What are the majority of the sensory neurons in the body? Remember we talked about multipolar, pseudo-unipolar, bipolar, and we talked about the neuron types. You guys have your notes from last week? Pull them up, because this is definitely material that's going to be on your exam.
Multipolar?
No, multipolar neurons are not sensory.
Unipolar?
Say it again.
Unipolar?
Unipolar. Okay. That's good with that. Unipolar or pseudo-unipolar, right? And what does a pseudo-unipolar neuron look like? Refresh me on what do they look like?
Is that the one where it's off from the main?
Is it? I don't know.
Yeah, because it's...
Yes, it is. So the cell body, right? The cell body kind of hangs off of the axon, right? Right? You guys okay with that? Right? Pseudo-unipolar or unipolar, right? The cell body hangs off the axon. So if that's our sensory nerve, well, the cell body's got to go somewhere, right? And it just so happens that the cell bodies of these neurons collect in the dorsal ganglion. Okay? So you have the dorsal root, and then you have the dorsal ganglion. And that's where the cell bodies of these sensory neurons, these afferent neurons, exist. You guys cool with that? So the dendrites are way out here in the periphery, right? And then the dendrites get activated, right, by different sensory receptors. And then that information follows along that axon, goes along that axon until it gets into the spinal cord, and then there's a synapse with another neuron in the spinal cord, right? So here's a synapse. It synapses with another neuron, and then that information goes up to the brain. You guys okay with that? And so the cell body for that sensory neuron is in the dorsal ganglion. And there are actually, as you might imagine, there are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of cell bodies, but I just drew one for the sake of simplicity. Does that make sense, though, that general pathway? Okay. Now, if that is sensory information, which area do you suppose the motor information is going to come out of? The ventral root. Yeah, so sensory information goes into the dorsal root, and motor information comes out of the ventral root. You guys cool with that? But remember, motor pathways are a little more complicated than sensory pathways, right? Because there are two branches of motor. There is the voluntary or somatic branch, right? And that's primarily skeletal muscle. That's stuff that we have conscious control over. And then there is the involuntary, or what we call the autonomic branch, right? Does that kind of make sense there? Okay. So we need to keep that in mind, because the somatic branch, okay, the somatic branch is what we call a single neuron system. A single neuron system. That is, there is a neuron that brings information from the brain down into the spinal cord, okay? There is a synapse with a motor neuron in the spinal cord, and then that motor neuron in the spinal cord goes all the way from the spinal cord to the muscle without interruption. That's why we call it a one neuron system. Does that make sense? It starts in the spinal cord at the synapse, and it goes all the way to the skeletal muscle that it innervates. That can be very long in some cases, as you might imagine. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? But that's somatic, right? So this is supposed to be drawing a skeletal muscle. When it comes to the autonomic nervous system, however, okay, I have efferent information comes from the brain down into the spinal cord. There's a synapse, and that's this little purple drawing here. Okay? And what happens is, this is a 2-neuron system. There's a synapse here with a neuron that goes through the ventral root, and then there is a second synapse in the ventral ganglion. Does that make sense? There's another synapse with another neuron in the ventral ganglion, and then that neuron ultimately takes the efferent, information down to different organs and glands, the heart, kidney, the lungs, etc. Okay, does that make sense? So this is kind of a 2-neuron system. So the cell bodies for the postsynaptic neuron are in the ventral ganglion. Does that make sense? You guys okay with that? So your autonomic nervous system goes through the ventral ganglion, okay? And then your efferent pathways in general go through the ventral root. But remember, the somatic nervous system does not go through the ventral ganglion, right? Because it is a 1-neuron system, right? It is a single neuron all the way from the spinal cord to the skeletal muscle that's innervated. You guys okay with that? Right? Does that kind of make sense there? Now, some other things that you want to be aware of, and I don't have it drawn here, but if I pull this brain out, that information is going to work its way up through the spinal cord, okay, and it's going to go into the brainstem, all right. And what's this structure right here? The distal part of the brainstem. This is known as the medulla oblongata, right? Right?
Yes.
Okay. It's going to be a really rough test if you guys are not on the ball with that. Okay. I just think Waterboy, right? Seen that movie Waterboy?
Mm-hmm.
Come on, you haven't seen that? Oh my goodness.
What?
Oh, you haven't really lived. Okay, I just remembered medulla oblongata. Anyway, you'll never forget. You'll never right? Medulla oblongata, and then you have this structure here, which is known as just superior to that is the pons. Yeah. Now, something interesting happens in the pons. Okay, in what are known as the pyramids of the pons, and it happens in a couple places in the brain. Remember when we talked about the optic chiasma? What happens with the optic chiasma? Right by the pituitary gland. Right here, actually. This whole structure here, optic chiasma. What happens?
Isn't that where it grasps off?
Yeah, and what's that called? That's known as decussation, right? Where you have crossover, right? So information that comes into the right eye crosses over and gets integrated in the left part of the brain, and then information that comes into the left eye decussates, crosses over, and gets processed into the right side of the brain, right? Well, guess what? Motor information, motor information coming out, so motor information, efferent information, actually crosses over in the pons, in the pyramids of the pons. So typically the motor cortex, on the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the motor cortex on the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Does that make sense? And that's because there is that decussation, there is that crossover in the pyramids of the pons. You guys okay with that? So when you are assessing somebody who may have had something called a stroke, you guys familiar with a stroke? Stroke, you guys are familiar with a heart attack, right? Well, stroke is equivalent. It's a brain attack where you either have an occlusion of a blood vessel or you have some blood, some bleeding that has compromised part of the brain. And if that blood flow gets cut off to the motor cortex or parts of the motor cortex on the left-hand side of the brain, your patient will have deficits where? right side of their body, right? So when you're assessing a stroke patient and they have some drooping here, or they have some paralysis of their right arm, what's the most likely thing going on? Well, the most likely thing is they have a problem with the left side of their brain. Does that make sense? So that's an important thing to know. That has very important clinical implications. All right, cool. So you guys okay with that? All right, so what I'm going to do now is I will, but let me just mention these and then we'll come back to these. So spinal nerves, you guys okay with that, right? We have 62 total spinal nerves. You have 8 pair of spinal nerves coming out of the cervical region, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 that comes out of the coccyx. You're not going to have to memorize where all of these things go, though, okay? You just have to know in general how many pairs you've got, how many total nerves do you have, okay? And then the other way that information gets in and out of the central nervous system is through what are called cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are nerves that come in and out, directly in and out of the brain itself. They don't need the spinal cord, they don't care about the spinal cord. So cranial nerves are direct. It is a nerve that comes directly in or out of the brain. You guys okay with that? So far so good? All right. Spinal nerves, however, they have to come off the spinal cord and they have all this ganglion business, right? The roots in the ganglion, they've got to deal with all that, contend with all that stuff. Cranial nerves, they don't care about that. They're like, nah, I'm going directly to where I need to go. Make sense? We'll talk about what they are specifically here in a few minutes. But are you guys okay with the 2 general ways that we get information in and out of the brain? Right? Through efferent, afferent pathways, and these efferent, afferent pathways can either come in or out of cranial nerves or spinal nerves. Those are the 2 ways. Make sense? All right, cool. So what I want to do now is I just want to examine a nerve, because the word quote-unquote nerve can have different meanings, right? When we're looking at individual neurons, a nerve is a neuron, but when I'm looking at a spinal nerve, okay, I'm looking at a spinal nerve, is this a single neuron that I'm looking at? No, it's no more a single neuron than a big old chunk of muscle is a single muscle fiber or myocyte, right? And neurons have nerves have a very similar structure to muscles. And so what I've done here is I've taken that spinal nerve and I've enlarged it here. And so what we see is if we cut a section through there, the nerve itself is surrounded, okay, in a connective tissue known as epineurium. Well, wait a minute. That's kind of like epimysium, isn't it? We talked about the muscle, right? And wouldn't you know it, okay, you have fascicles, okay, which are bundles of neurons, just like you have fascicles of muscles, right, which are bundles of myocytes. And the fascicles, okay, within the nerve are covered in their own kind of connective tissue called perineurium, right? So you have epineurium on the outside, perineurium, and then when I pull an individual neuron out, the neuron itself is coated in yet another connective tissue known as endoneurium. So you have epineurium, perineurium, endoneurium, and I've peeled back the endoneurium there, and then you can see an axon of a neuron here, and you can see the little myelin sheaths there. You guys okay with that? So it's pretty much the same structure, connective tissue-wise, as you see with muscle, where you have the endoneurium, the perineurium, and the epineurium, just like you'd see in muscle with this kind of this triple layer of connective tissue. All right? So far, so good? All right? Guys tracking all right? Cool. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about these cranial nerves, okay? These cranial nerves. So these are nerves that come in and out of, directly in and out of the brain, okay? There are 12 of them, and they come in pairs, okay? So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, one for each side, right? One for, you can kind of look at it as a hemisphere, right? One for each hemisphere. And the way that we label them is the highest up to the lowest. And what I mean by highest is I mean most superior to most inferior. So let's start at the most superior nerve. Okay, what is the most superior nerve? The olfactory, and you can see here the olfactory bulbs or nerves are actually superior to where the optic nerves come out. So here are my optic nerves right down here, and then right on top of them are the olfactory bulbs. And you look, well, wait a minute, my eyes are above my nose. What the heck? Well, that's not where the nerves start, though, right? That's not where they come out. So, the olfactory nerve is your first cranial nerve, and what do you suppose the olfactory nerve does? Smell. So is it a sensory or motor nerve? And it is sensory only. And so you can see I have arrows in front of the cranial nerves that are sensory only. Many of the cranial nerves are motor and sensory, but only a few of them are sensory only. Okay? So the olfactory nerve, okay, is our sense of smell. The second cranial nerve is the optic nerve. Okay, and you can see the optic chiasma here, and then you can actually see the optic nerves as they go and innervate the eye here. What do you suppose the optic nerve does for us? It's vision, yeah. This is so is this sensory or motor? And is it sensory or motor only? Sensory only, right? So the first two cranial nerves are sensory only. Then the third cranial nerve is something known as the oculomotor nerve. The oculomotor nerve. What does the oculomotor nerve do? Specifically, what kind of movement? Probably going to want to have your textbook out and pull up the table.
Raises the eyelid?
Right? Does it do anything else? Does it do anything to the pupils? Perhaps. By chance. Is it? Does it, or are you just guessing?
I'm totally guessing.
Might be a good guess, though. Might be a good guess. What's that? Does it? You're just guessing, aren't you? Don't guess. That's why I tell you guys you need to bring your books to class, right?
Oh, I can't think so.
Those cranial nerves. Those cranial nerves. Kind of want you guys to follow along as we go through these. So
It moves the eye.
well, there's a lot of potential movement, though. That what kind of motion is it involved in?
It dilates the pupil. Changes the shape of the lens of the eye.
Okay, now we're nailing it down a little bit, huh? So it helps focusing, right? And it is involved in dilation of the pupil. And this is an important nerve for you guys to know, particularly if you're going into healthcare, because sometimes people that have head injuries, if they have bleeding or swelling in their head, that bleeding or that swelling can put pressure on the oculomotor nerve, and it will actually cause the pupil on the side of the injury to dilate. And when you shine light into it, it won't constrict. It's what we call a dilated non-reactive pupil, or a fixed non-reactive pupil. So when you shine your light into somebody's eyes and you're looking for the pupils to respond, okay, you're checking out the oculomotor nerve. Okay? That's mainly motor, okay, that provides a lot of motor information, obviously. And then the next one is the trochlear. What's the trochlear nerve do? What's the trochlear nerve do? Does a few things. What does it do?
Moves the eyeballs.
What kind of motion?
Down into the side.
Down into the side, yeah. So downward motion and lateral motion of the eye. Good. So when you shine your light into somebody's eyes and you say, keep your head still and follow the light with your eyes. Maybe some of you actually had somebody check that on you. Guess what? Part of what they're checking is the trochlear nerve. Okay? The next one, okay, the fifth cranial nerve is the trigeminal nerve. And this is called the trigeminal nerve because it actually, as it leaves the cranium, it breaks into 3 branches. And what does it do? It is both motor and sensory, so it does a few things. What are some of the big things the trigeminal nerve does?
Causes abduction of the eye.
What's that?
Make them look up.
You guys agree with that? Does it do anything else? Do anything else? Trigeminal nerve? It does because there's a disease known as trigeminal neuralgia that causes lots of problems. So guess what? We got to know what the trigeminal nerve does.
To the side as well.
Okay. Anything else?
It senses like stuff here in the mouth and, you know.
So it provides some oral facial sensation too, doesn't it? Right. And have you guys ever heard of something called trigeminal neuralgia? Anyone ever heard of that? Okay, all you Google scholars, I know there are a couple Google scholars in here. Type that. Type trigeminal neuralgia in. Look it up, because it's a disease that it's relatively common. You run into it. So. Let's nail this down here. Type it in. Somebody's got a computer, I know. Computer.
Symptoms range from mild to severe facial pain, often
Yeah.
triggered by chewing, speaking, or brushing the teeth.
There we go. Yes, it's very severe, causes some very severe facial pain. Absolutely. All right, good deal. Okay, moving right along. All right, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Moving on to 6. 8, 10, 11, 12. Hey, how about that? So the abducens is next, and what does the abducens do? What's its job? The abducens.
Abducts the eye.
Makes the eyes look from side to side.
Sure. Sure of that?
Look down. So like you used to roll your eyes. Look up.
I'm getting ready to roll my eyes here. What does it say?
Lateral movement.
Good. Yeah, lateral motion. Good. All right. Boy, a lot of eye stuff here, isn't there? A lot of eye stuff. Well, that makes sense, though. All right, so lateral motion, abduction. Okay, facial nerve. This is another really important one. Okay, and there's some diseases. So what does a facial nerve do? Where do you think? Where do you suppose it goes?
To the face.
To the face. Right, motor sensation to the face.
Taste receptors.
Taste as well. So it has both motor and sensory function, doesn't it? So face. And when this gets injured, sometimes it can cause problems with paralysis, facial muscles. That's good with that? Okay. Moving right along to 8, which goes by 2 names, either the auditory or the vestibular cochlear. And this is primarily a sensory nerve. And what does it provide? What special sense does it provide? Hearing, yeah. Hearing and balance. Cannot forget, and a big part of our sense of balance comes from this as well. That's why anyone ever had an ear infection? And what happens sometimes in an ear infection? You get vertigo, huh? Because the cochlea, which is something we'll talk about here in a week or two, is involved in balance. So hearing and balance. Good. All right, moving right along to the glossopharyngeal. So glossal has to do with the mouth and tongue, so probably has something to do with the tongue, right? What does it do? The glossopharyngeal. Glossopharyngeal.
Swallowing.
Swallowing. What else?
Chewing.
Huh?
Chewing?
Chewing? Is it? Is the glossopharyngeal chewing? What does it say?
Muscles involved in swallowing.
Salivating?
Salivation? Okay. Swallowing? Salivary gland. Here,
Taste sensation. Provide taste sensation from the posterior third of the tongue.
okay, so it provides some taste as well. So taste just doesn't come from one place. Good. Taste, swallowing. Good. All right, the next one, uber important. This is number 10, the vagus nerve. All right, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is critically important. It is the majority of our parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. The vagus nerve provides a big portion of the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? The parasympathetic. So the feed and breed, okay, rest and repair kind of stuff. So when it comes to digestion, when it comes to slowing your heart rate down, okay, though when it comes to making mucus, all those kinds of things, that is primarily through the parasympathetic nervous system, which is one of the 2 branches of the autonomic, right, nervous system. Okay, so as you might guess, when we look at the spinal cord, what branch of the autonomic nervous system primarily comes out of the spinal cord? Don't think about it too hard. If the parasympathetic nervous system is coming out of the vagus nerve, which is a cranial nerve, the sympathetic nervous system must be what's coming out of your spinal cord, your sympathetic. Yes. That is why sometimes people that have spinal cord injuries, particularly high spinal cord injury, if you injure the spinal cord high enough, you cut off the sympathetic nervous system. And remember, the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight response, right? So it's what increases your heart rate, what increases your blood pressure, okay? Those kinds of things. If you cut that off by injuring the spinal cord, but the vagus nerve, the part of your autonomic nervous system that slows everything down, is still working just fine because it's a cranial nerve, right? It doesn't care about the spinal cord. Then it takes over, doesn't it? And what do you suppose happens to your patient? Huh? Yeah, their heart rate gets really slow, their blood pressure gets really low, and they go into something known as spinal shock. So high spinal cord injuries, okay, can cause spinal shock due to cutting off the sympathetic nervous system, okay? And as long as the vagus nerve is still working, their parasympathetic nervous system takes over and it's unopposed, right? That's all they have is parasympathetic tones. Their heart rate gets really low, their blood pressure gets really low. Okay, it could be a real life-threatening thing. Okay. Sometimes if people have really fast heart rates, one of the things we can do is we can stimulate that vagus nerve. There are various ways we can do that. There are receptors in the carotid arteries, and we're called baroreceptors, and you can massage those receptors and they will activate parasympathetic tone. It might decrease your heart rate. You can have somebody bear down like they're going to go poop, and that bearing down will activate what's known as a vagal response, which is the vagus nerve, right? And this actually is not an uncommon problem, particularly with people that have like constipation, things like that. They're really constipated, they're trying to go, and they end up passing out on the toilet due to this vagal response, their heart rate getting really, really slow. And this is not uncommon during procedures where we are using instruments, where we are placing instruments into somebody's rectum to look into their gastrointestinal tract. That may elicit the vagus response as well. So a lot of good medical problems can originate from these cranial nerves here. And then you have the accessory or the spinal accessory nerve. Okay, and what does this primarily do? There you go. Yeah, good. And then finally, the last one is the hypoglossal. And that probably has something to do with the tongue or mouth. Movement of the tongue. Good. Good. So how in the heck do we remember these? Look at that. There's a table in the book right there. Yeah, there is a mnemonic. There's a mnemonic in the book. I learned a slightly different one, and unfortunately I can't use it for you guys. Huh? Because I like my job and I'm not tenured. I'm not tenured, and you know, so yeah. But it does start off with O to touch and feel, and I'm sure you can go to the internet and you can figure out the rest of it if you really want to.
It's probably the one I'll remember.
It is very easy to remember, but I will let you guys go to the internet and look it up. Okay, just type in O to touch and feel cranial nerves, and you will find the one I'm talking about, and it'll make it very easy. Yeah. You take your safe search off, go incognito or whatever you have to do, but you'll find it and you'll remember it. All right, you guys okay with that? All right. It'll help in it. Yeah, oh, you found it already, didn't you? Yeah. Like I said, I can't really say it, so. All right. You guys good with that? So far, so good, right? This stuff isn't too bad. All right. So let's see how we're doing on time. 48 minutes. All right, we'll go another 10. All right. So I shouldn't expect you guys to have any problems with cranial nerves. Now what I want to do is I want to pause for a minute. And I want to talk about how does the brain get blood? And the reason I want to talk about this is the brain uses something like 10 or 20% of all the circulation coming out of our heart. Uses a lot of glucose, a lot of sugar. Those neurons in your brain need a constant supply of perfusion, constant blood supply. And if that blood supply is interrupted, what happens? They quit working very quickly, right? They quit working very quickly, and they will die within minutes. Okay, so nervous tissue, the neurons, are not like other types of tissue that can go without blood and oxygen for an extended period of time, you only have minutes before your neurons start to die. And so getting blood to the brain is a very important thing. Okay. And so what I want to do is I've drawn this up on the board here for you guys. And what I want you to do is, right here is the spinal cord. So I want you to, and I'll hold the brain up here. So imagine that this is the brainstem right down here sticking out at you. Can you guys kind of imagine that? And so what I'm doing is I'm looking at the inferior aspect of the brain. That's what we're looking at here. And these vessels here are right here near the brainstem, okay? And these vessels up here are way up here around the optic chiasm. You guys okay with that? So I'm inferior to superior, and you kind of have to use your imagination, okay? I just can't really draw it really any better than that. So there are two major ways we get blood into the brain, okay? There are two major ways. There are two blood vessels that bring blood into the back of the brain, the inferior posterior aspect of the brain, down here toward the brainstem and the cerebellum. Those blood vessels we've talked about already, and those blood vessels are known as the vertebral arteries. And those are the arteries, okay, and I don't know if you guys can see this, but these, remember when we talked about the vertebral foramen in the cervical vertebrae? Those arteries come up through those vertebral foramen. And so here's one right here. So this is posterior. You guys see that there? That's what you're looking at right here. The vertebral arteries coming up and going into the brain stem. You guys okay with that? So that is your posterior inferior blood supply. The other two major blood vessels that come into your brain are known as the internal carotid arteries. You actually have an internal carotid and an external carotid artery in your neck. The external carotid arteries are superficial and they supply blood to the face. The internal carotid arteries are deep and they go up and they go right into here, okay, and you can actually see them coming up through here, okay, and so they come right up here near the optic chiasma, right? So far so good?
The internal ones go.
The internal carotids.
Nice.
Yeah, so these are the internal carotids right here coming up in. And the external carotids go to your face, right? They're not, yeah, so we're not really going to talk about them because they're not really relevant as far as the brain goes. You guys okay with that? So blood flow that comes up through the vertebral arteries meets at what's known as the basilar artery. And the basilar artery is this artery right here, this big fat looking thing here, and it runs right up along the base of the brainstem. And then there are little arteries that come off of it. You have the these little branches here. These are known as the pontine arteries, these small ones. The first large one down here is known as the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So that goes to the cerebellum. Okay? So cerebellum, the pons right here, and then the next major one are the superior cerebellar, they go to the cerebellum, and then the posterior cerebellar, they go to the cerebellum as well. All right? So all of this is brainstem, and then where the internal carotids come in, okay, these arteries, as they come in, then the blood that comes out of these arteries goes not to the brainstem or the cerebellum, but blood goes to the cerebrum. Okay? So the internal carotids primarily supply the cerebrum, your upper brain, with blood, and the vertebral arteries primarily supply your pons, your brainstem, and your cerebellum, the lower parts of your brain with blood supply. You guys okay with that? Now, the interesting thing is, here, you have these pathways that allow blood to flow up and down depending on what's going on. And you have a pathway back here known as the posterior communicating artery. And then you have a pathway up here known as the anterior communicating artery. And why do we have those? So here is the posterior communicating here and the anterior communicating up here. The reason that we have those is if the blood supply back here were to fail for some reason, my vertebral artery was to become compromised, blood coming from the internal carotid could work its way back down and it could backflow these areas through the posterior communicating artery, right? Or if my internal carotid artery failed here, I could have blood from the vertebral arteries come up through the posterior communicating and anterior communicating and backflow into the cerebrum. So it's a backup mechanism. And that backup mechanism that kind of makes a circle right around the area of the optic chiasma is known as the circle of Willis. Okay, the circle of Willis. And that's an important area because we can get little aneurysms. Little aneurysms are little bulges in blood vessels and arteries. And sometimes those aneurysms are called buried aneurysms. Sometimes they can rupture. And when they rupture, they fill the space underneath the arachnoid. So between the arachnoid and the pia mater fills up with blood. And that produces something called a subarachnoid hemorrhage. So you have this hemorrhaging basically at the base of the brain, filling up the arachnoid space and putting pressure on some really important areas, right? Because you have your cardiac and your respiratory centers down here in the base of your brain. So a subarachnoid hemorrhage due to a ruptured buried aneurysm can be a very life-threatening problem. Okay. You guys okay with that? So far, so good? All right, let me just talk about a couple more things and we'll get you on a break. So I just want to review basic brain terminology. So here I have a cross-section of the brain. We're looking at the cerebral cortex. And remember the cortex, let me just pull it out here, has these folds, right? And the top of the hill is known as a what? A gyrus, right? That's the top of the hill. When the hill kind of goes down, okay, goes down in, it sulks down, that's known as a sulcus. And then a very deep sulcus is known as a fissure, right? You guys okay with that? So you have your gyrus, you have your sulcus, you have your fissures. And when we talk about the cerebrum, the outer part is known as the cerebral cortex, right? And what kind of matter is it primarily? It is primarily gray matter. Primarily consists of cell bodies, and you guys remember the brain dissection when we took a section of that, and then you looked at that section, and you saw something kind of like this where you had the darker coloring, the gray matter, and then the white matter deep to that, right? So the cell bodies and then all the axons, okay? So, you guys okay with everything we've talked about so far? More or less makes sense? All right, cool. So we'll stop there, and then we'll pick up talking about parts of the brain, what's going on in the brain.